Yes, so should we begin?
I think so.
Yeah, please
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I am Ida. My panelists and I agreed that we will each do our talks, and then we will have the Q&A at the end. And I will start. I finished my master's degree in psychology from Roskilde University in Denmark in January, just 2 months before the current COVID-19 crisis. The world seemed a lot different then, but still we were facing consequences of our actions in form of the climate situation. I am currently an independent scholar working on my PhD proposal, and I want to present some of the ideas I wish to work with. My talk is called "The Sleeping Dogs Are Awaking, Rethinking Moralities and Possibilities for Action in a Time of Crisis to Save Our More Than Human World." The overarching theme of this talk will be a notion of interrelatedness, both on a practical and on a theoretical level. Instead of a landscape of dualisms and a war of species, I will invite you to join a world where we become involved in one another's lives and acknowledge that we are all linked together and to the world surrounding us with all that this world includes. I am preoccupied with breaking down barriers and erasing the sharply drawn lines between humans and the world. More specifically, between humans and other animals. This is a big task, I know. Anchored in critical psychology and subject science, I will discuss how a psychology from the standpoint of the subject can contribute in understanding the current crisis, and I will dwell on thoughts of morality as an interwoven part of the human conduct of everyday life. On my journey, I am thinking with people who urges me not to necessarily think of a great solution to the crisis and a return to better days, but to look at the potential of conflictuality and to stay with the trouble. The talk will be divided into 2 parts. In the first, I center around the trouble I think we should engage in and take seriously. And in the second, I wish to talk about new possibilities for action in psychology in a time of crisis. I call part 1, The Trouble, Morality, Machinery, and the Anthropocene. People today name our time the Anthropocene, referring to the huge impact human activities have on the earth. Human actions have great consequences, many of which we face as we speak. Currently, the COVID-19, the roaring climate crisis, along with other imminent crises as discussed on this conference. Even though the crises have different names and can be looked upon individually, it is clear that they are interrelated. If not by their character, then by human action that through time has led us to where we are now. Examples of these human actions are the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and the late capitalism, all interrelated by humans' wish of being greater and better and in more control of a world uncontrollable. Even our earliest ancestors took advantage of the resources of the earth. But along the way, our sense of interrelatedness was dissociated. The consequences of human actions create a borderland in form of the dichotomy between human and nature, cementing the anthropocentric view of the world. Biologist Catherine Richardson makes the point that we need to think more systematically like our ancestors did. I will argue that a psychology with a ground focus on interrelatedness does exactly this, stressing the importance of looking at phenomena in their context. The dichotomy between human and nature is not rock solid. This becomes paradoxically clear when we look at another common ground between the climate crisis and the COVID-19, the lucid interrelationship between humans and other animals. One practice of the so-called Anthropocene is the human-animal relationship we call agriculture, centered around the human domestication of other animals. I situate my thoughts in particularly the Western countries. We have a very long history of killing animals for food and warmth, a practice that has taken a turn from mere survival to a question of optimization, overproduction, and overload. The practice of killing animals for food has become so excessive, industrialized, and technologized that it has become hard to keep up with the heavy machinery and to realize that we all have a share in lubricating its hinges. When stating this, I build on the thoughts of philosopher Günther Anders describing the Promethean discrepancy, understood as the gap between the world of technology and our ability to visualize it, which as a result slows our sense of responsibility and morality. By excessively killing animals for food, we challenge not only their, but our very existence. This practice brings physical damage to our livelihood on the planet. In producing meat and products from animals, we consequently ruin the biodiversity we are so dependent on, and we make sure that the CO2 level rises with a deadly speed. In short, this is double death, double kill, and the war of species, emphasizing that it is indeed survival of the fittest, and humans are fitter than anything. Psychologically, our participation in this practice challenges our moral self-understanding because no matter how we look at it, it centers around an act that in most other cases is seen as immoral, the act of taking another life. The current technologized practice of killing animals for food makes it possible to look away and to differ between animals and render some killable and some other lucky ones not. In doing so, we basically decide which lives are worth saving, and therefore we are creating more dichotomies by engaging in speciesism. In my master's thesis, I analyzed how this practice of excessive use of animals is a lose-lose situation. This shows that our relationship with other animals indeed is a conflictual part of our conduct of everyday life, and whether we want it or not, we continue to build borders between the human life and life of nature as if one exists without the other. On a theoretical level, the psychology centering around eating meat is often characterized by a view of the subject as being submissive by defense mechanisms and the unconscious, and it takes on the mechanic task of categorizing human behavior, which cements the anthropocentric view of the world in the self-understanding of psychology. This focus ignores the context in which the subject actively takes part, failing to acknowledge the interrelatedness, and this way psychology is part of creating our current crisis. Part 2, Rethinking Morality and Human Practice. I want to address the immanent morality of human practice in the Anthropocene. This because the question of morality is pivotal when debating our common crisis, since human actions as opposed to the forces of Mother Nature and the actions of other animals are subject to moral evaluation. When rethinking morality, I argue that morality cannot be looked upon as a separate phenomena from practice, and that there is no border between morality and the conduct of everyday life. Morality is, as Charles Tolman explains, at the epicenter of human practice, and therefore part of our self-understanding. This cements the importance of the responsibility for psychology, because psychology as a science is intertwined with morality, making it necessary that it creates understandings that genuinely serve human needs and interests, instead of reducing human action to a question of machinery behavior. To do so, psychology must start from the standpoint of the subject in order to break down the barriers between human and the surrounding world. This means rejecting the epistemic God's eye view on the subject. By this, I mean that psychology must begin from the subject's situated experiences from its conduct of everyday life and practice. At the center of a psychology from the standpoint of the subject is, as Klaus Holzkamp explains, an intention of self-understanding. Self-understanding points to subjects in plural and subjects in context, since a coming to an understanding with myself is not possible without others. We need each other, and we need the world around us, this including other animals. In a joint self-understanding project, the participation and practice do not become a question of merely immoral individual behavior, but of a collective practice with a collective understanding of morality, built on goods that are debatable and negotiable and is sought to benefit all. This means that whether the practice of killing animals is morally defiable is neither an individual nor a societal affair. It is interrelated. This also means that placing blame or moralizing things is not part of my agenda. I merely suggest examining further the practice to better understand it and to help us find new possibilities for action in a practice that is threatening our existence and challenging our moral self-understanding. These notions of a morality interwoven with the conduct of everyday life and subjects and a world interrelated tend to be problematic in a discipline like psychology, which historically too fast only focuses on the individual disconnected from the society and the world in general. Even in critical psychology, starting from the standpoint of the subject seeking to break down the subject-world dichotomy, trouble occurs. The focus is still on human practice. The analytical framework is too narrow, and we need to learn new tricks in order for us to find new possibilities for action. A crucial task for psychology is not to insulate itself. If we only look at the particular person and the particular person's relation to other persons, we risk to neglect all of that which make the human conduct of life. That being the technology that allows us to meet here, the beautiful spring flowers, the dogs barking in the backyard disturbing my concentration, etc. We need to address our social and societal interrelatedness, not only to each other, but also to other living creatures and species. In doing so, we need to scientifically not insulate ourselves either. Therefore, I think we can engage in this trouble by drawing at the theory and thoughts of Donna Haraway and her notion of tentacular thinking. I argue that a psychology from the standpoint of the subject must consider human practice as being more than human, to break down the walls we build separating us from all that make our conduct of everyday lives. One part of the more than human practice is the complex, sorrowful, and also fruitful relationship between humans and other animals. I build on Haraway's notion of relational ontologies in my attempt to broaden the view of the relation between subject and world in critical psychology. Haraway argues for multi-species alliances and for learning to live and die well with each other. This makes us all practitioners in life and cements our common responsibility in caring for our world. Animals, in her view, can be seen as companion species and an inherent part of the human conduct of life. The notion of companion species means that companion species are constantly in subject and object shaping entanglements. This view on animals renders it possible to acknowledge that we are interrelated with them and that we live with them in significant otherness. It underlines that humans do not live separately from other animals. By regarding animals as companion species, human exceptionalism can be rendered because the focus on human control and the othering of the animals is challenged. Broadening the analytical framework in critical psychology brings new possibilities for action, and it can contribute by helping us explore the reasons for action from the standpoint of the subject, to learn more about this practice and to find new action possibilities. So far, the trouble brought by the practice of killing other animals has led us here. We cannot separate ourselves from other animals, and we cannot afford to look away from this practice, as it challenges our moral self-understanding and our very existence. Instead of hoping for a big solution, we need to render each other capable and become practitioners in life and dive deeper into the reasons why we act like we do in order to find new possibilities for action. On this journey, critical psychology with a broadened analytical framework can be a companion explorer. But first, we need to acknowledge our interrelatedness. This might be unpleasant, ugly, and come with personal losses and great economic challenges on a societal level, but this is no time to let the sleeping dogs lie. We need to wake up, stay with the trouble, mourn our losses, and examine further this practice of killing other animals and overall our relationship to other animals, to learn new action possibilities and to create a world built on a notion of the common good. So that was all from me, and now I look forward to hearing more about the unknown. Michelle?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for that really fascinating talk. My name is Dr. Michelle Bentley, and I'm a reader in international relations at Royal Holloway, University of London, where I'm also director of the Centre for International Security. Now, you may have noticed in that introduction that there was absolutely no mention of psychology. I am very much an international relations scholar, and so this paper comes with something of a disclaimer that I am a psychology expert in no way, but while I'm approaching the themes of this conference from a politics perspective, my research is still relevant in that this deals with ideas about how we, and more specifically policymakers, construct crisis, and the way in which the risks involved in that are understood and acted on. When we face the threat of major crisis, when we're talking about threats that, for example, could cause thousands or millions of deaths, like COVID-19, what does that mean? And how do we comprehend this politically? But what particularly interests me is how we deal with crises that haven't occurred yet. When we're not talking about a crisis that has happened or is happening, as COVID-19 is happening now, but when we're talking about a risk that could devastate us in the future, but it's only an idea, a possibility, a maybe, and we don't know if it will happen and what it would mean if it did. How do you conceptualize what you do not know? And how do you deal with that monster under the bed when you don't even know what it looks like? And I want to use this talk to speak about one specific type of such a crisis, biological warfare. This is a great example of a threat that we do not know. But COVID-19 may change this. By showing us what a major outbreak of disease looks like, will this challenge and shift our perceptions of biological weapons, specifically because it changes what we think we know about this threat? And as I said, this is very much going to be discussed from a politics approach. But what I also want to do as part of that is to explore those more psychological dynamics between what we know and what we don't, and how that translates into political action. Now, I have a few concerns about starting this paper because I want to start it in, I think, is a pretty horrific way, which is about talking about former US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. I don't think it gets much scarier than that, but Rumsfeld was incredibly important in publicizing a key idea about about how we understand risk, and specifically the risk of big nasty things happening. So you may remember his concept of the known unknowns. In 2002, as the war on terror was really starting to heat up, Rumsfeld was questioned about the claims that the Bush administration had made that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction buried in his back garden, and that he was about to give these to terrorist organizations who were then obviously going to blow up the entire world. And in response to these claims, Rumsfeld was asked about the fact that there seemed to be absolutely no evidence that any of this had happened or was about to. And Rumsfeld replied saying this, and this is a quote: "There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there's things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know." Now, in relation to Iraq, you might be thinking that sounds like a load of rubbish, and you'd be right. And it doesn't help that Rumsfeld also refused to say which of these categories of threat Saddam would fall into, ostensibly for reasons of national security. But Rumsfeld still articulates a very interesting model of threat. So specifically threats we know, threats we probably should know, but for some reason can't comprehend in that way, and the completely unknown threat, the one you never saw coming. And to this, there's also been added the unknown known. So a case where we know something will occur, but we effectively ignore it as if we didn't. And this balance between the known and the unknown influences how we think about risk. In effect, the unknown opens up our understanding to speculation. And this is not to say that known threats are not subject to manipulation and construction, but that an unknown threat creates something of a vacuum. On the one hand, this can lead to us developing worst case scenarios and/or exaggerating that unknown risk. So we're getting into ideas such as Anthony Giddens' precautionary principle or Paul Slovak's dread risk. But we don't always exaggerate. The lack of certainty can also see potential crises downplayed. That same opportunity for speculation goes the other way and becomes a lack of momentum for action. It effectively creates a sense of distance between the actor and the threat, which then causes them to take that threat less seriously. And this can very much be a temporal distance, in the same way that, say climate change is often dismissed because it's seen as something that may be perceived as happening way off in the future. So the unknown threat is also understood as something that may or may not happen, where that too is framed by the future, as something that is not happening now. And whereby that means that there's none of the immediacy of the known. And we can start to apply this framework to COVID-19, and more specifically, what it tells us about another potential crisis, that crisis of biological warfare. And biological warfare has always been something of an unknown risk, not unknown. The threat posed by biological weapons is definitely there. But it's a threat that lies somewhere in that known unknown crossover. Because we really don't know when it comes to biological weapons. They've never really been used. We've never seen what they can do. And we can't test biological weapons on the scale of a major attack to find out, either because that would involve a level and type of human testing that goes beyond what we would consider ethically acceptable, or because you just don't go around releasing severely contagious biological agents and causing global pandemics on a whim. So while in principle, a biological weapons attack could cause an epic global crisis, our understanding of this is hindered by the way in which that risk is only a hypothetical and an elusive one. And of course, it's absolutely marvelous that we haven't experienced a major biological assault, but that not knowing shapes our understanding of the threat in ways that aren't necessarily very helpful. What we've seen, arguably, is that this threat has not been taken very seriously, and that there has been a lack of progress on biological weapons arms control. Now, this isn't to say we haven't seen any progress. In 1972, the international community negotiated the Biological Weapons Convention, which bans both the use and the possession of biological arms. But that convention has been mired in controversy. In particular, states have disagreed over provisions surrounding verification. So the measures that ensure no one is developing these weapons in violation of that agreement. Verification is really a long-standing bugbear, to the extent that some analysts say this will undermine the convention's entire future. And these are arguments that have fallen into that vacuum of speculation and unknownness that surrounds biological warfare. If we look at the history of biological weapons, we just see one long argument about what it is they can actually do, with some people saying this is definitely going to mean crisis, versus those who say it will never happen, that biological weapons can be controlled, that that major threat does not exist. And with no consensus or opportunity to build consensus the way we can around a known threat, there has been no real moving forward in preventing biological warfare from becoming a reality. Essentially, the lack of known information means we don't even know how to have a productive conversation about this. Without a workable conceptualization of the problem, discourse surrounding an unknown threat is difficult, if not impossible, to develop. So what would happen to our understanding of biological weapons if, say, a major pandemic occurred, locking down most of the world and threatening to kill millions? What if we actually experienced what a biological strike could look like? Well, as you've probably already realized, we're in the process of finding out right now. So will COVID-19 change this? If the problem is that we can't comprehend what a biological weapons attack will look like, well, now we have a major global pandemic right on our doorstep. We can see what this could mean, not only in terms of public health and the many deaths that this has tragically caused, but also issues like the social disruption that this could create. So is biological warfare now a known threat? Well, not entirely. There's some obvious caveats here. First of all, a pandemic is not the same as biowarfare. Most obviously, and where this conference is about the psychology of crisis, we respond to different threats in different ways. And the way in which we mentally deal with a natural outbreak is going to be very different to what it would mean to deal with a deliberate and vicious attack made against us, possibly within the context of a wider conflict, or say a terrorist strike. The psychological impact of being attacked would engender a very different response. And yes, there are conspiracy theories that COVID-19 is a biological weapon or the result of a biowarfare experiment gone wrong. And yes, a lot of the rhetoric around COVID-19 reflects a quite military narrative where this has been constructed as a war against the disease. But still, this is not a perfect parallel. We also don't know how far a biological attack would mirror the transmission of any natural outbreak. That's still very much in the realm of the unknown. There's also an issue in that it isn't like we haven't experienced terrible disease before, but that this has never been a defining factor in the biological weapons debate. Yes, people have spoken about previous epidemics and pandemics as evidence of what biological weapons could do, but this has never been central to the debate. Just look at Ebola in 2014, which had no real impact on perceptions of biological warfare. To go back to Paul Slovik's concept of dread risk, that effect heuristic requires some sort of psychological framework. So, in his case, he assesses the negative attitudes towards peaceful nuclear power and radiation, where those are largely drawn from perceptions of nuclear weapons, which are unsurprisingly not great. Although, if you've seen the Chernobyl miniseries, you might think the idea of nuclear power as dead risk is completely appropriate. But that same type of frame of reference has never developed around biological warfare, despite the fact that we have experienced natural disease outbreaks, which could have done so. But COVID-19 is unprecedented, at least in living political memory. And yes, it's also the case that outbreaks like Ebola did not happen to white Western people. COVID-19 has pervaded the Western experience in a way that no other disease truly has. And yes, diseases like cancer and HIV/AIDS may be recognized as threats within that experience, but they are not that fast-paced contagion that a biological weapon would create. And so what we've seen in relation to COVID-19 in a way that we've never seen around other major health risks is that there is suddenly a whole lot of new attention being paid to biological warfare. So COVID-19 has really thrown a spotlight onto this threat. And I argue that this is because that threat now feels more known, not a known, but people are starting to build up that Slovik style frame of reference. That distance that I was talking about earlier is now not so relevant. Our understanding stops pushing the threat of biological weapons into that future context because it feels like it is happening to us right now, albeit only in a related sense. And in doing so, it creates a sense of immediacy around the threat of biological warfare that was not there before. And quite frankly, why wouldn't we be more moved by the more vivid representation that we see around us? Before, we could speculate about what biowarfare would look like, but we knew this was only imagination. The same way we imagine, what would happen if an asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out the entire human race. When we see a threat in front of us, that changes our perception simply because it is more compelling to us. And indeed, biological warfare is not actually a topic that lends itself well to vivid imaginings. Well, we know that millions could die as a result of a bioweapon strike, and we know that disease is not a nice thing. This is still a type of information that often gets reduced to statistics, to numbers, which obscures the human element of what this would mean. So this would be a case of, to cite him again, Slovik's psychophysical numbing, or in more political theory terms, Judith Butler's conception of grievable life. That human element that has so often been lacking in the debate on biowarfare is now brought out through COVID-19. And this could potentially be a plus for things like arms control. This knownness could put new pressure on policymakers to strengthen agreements such as the Biological Weapons Convention. While there would still be disagreements over the nature and viability of issues like verification, the pandemic could create a whole new global governance platform for at least further debate on biological weapons control, because at least then there is something more solid to talk about. And we've already seen something slightly like this happen before. A few days after 9/11 came a series of anthrax attacks. So letters contaminated with anthrax were sent to senators and news organizations in the US, unfortunately killing 5 people. And in response, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1540, which is designed to promote international cooperation, preventing terrorists from acquiring biological arms and other forms of WMD. So the anthrax attacks had made that threat of biological terrorism more known. or at least everyone thought it was. I mean, we still don't actually know who carried out those attacks. And the suspect, a guy called Bruce Evans, is not what we would think of as a terrorist. But it allowed people to put a previously unknown threat into a more known context, where this then allowed for international action. And indeed, what else was the Bush administration trying to do by having the war on terror, but to try and make unknown threats, things like Saddam and his WMD, trying to make these feel like known threats, where this would then justify the military action they wanted in Iraq. Knowing, or the perception of knowing, gives you a more solid basis for action. And in terms of biological weapons, this could mean that we finally start to resolve some major issues that have hindered our ability to control these arms in the past through building consensus on what we understand. Now, as I've already hinted, there are limits to this. As I said, COVID-19 is not a deliberate attack as far as we're aware. So biological warfare is not a known by any stretch of the imagination. So there is still scope for that speculation that is so important to understanding how people respond to unknown threats in a way that does not apply to the known. This approach also assumes that we do not deny what we know. But advocates of biological warfare may attempt to deny the relevance of COVID-19, especially where it may strengthen the case against their position. It may also be that once COVID-19 is over, if it ever is, we will move on. We'll forget. We will forget what we think is known and go back to the unknown when we're not stuck in our homes instead of meeting in person at academic conferences, when we no longer have to worry about standing 2 meters apart. Will we start to forget what it means to experience a pandemic and then relate this back to the threat of biological weapons? As with so many issues involving COVID-19, it's going to take time to know what the answer is to all of this and see what is going to happen. But I hope that this paper shows the ways in which this pandemic could shift and shape the debate on biological warfare. And that specifically, by giving us a new sense of perception on the threat, by making this more known to us, we could see positive implications in terms of more serious arms control that could stop disease being used as a weapon. So thank you all so much for listening, and I'll hand over to the next person on our panel.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. I'm Jan de Vos. I'm currently a lecturer in social psychology, critical social psychology at Cardiff University. Okay, strange times we are living, times in which we academics have to have a theory of everything. That is, we have to assess it all. So first I refrained from doing this. I was happy to be locked down. So I was not going to write on COVID. So locked down, I was correcting the proofs of my book. So allow me this short commercial. The book is just published and the title is The Digitalization of Intersubjectivity, a Psych-Critique of the Digital Death Drive. Okay, but once the proofs corrected, I began to realize that it was not possible not to write or talk about COVID. To stay not only in business, but to stay human and to stay part of society. So here's my contribution, for better or worse. It's entitled COVID-19, Never Waste a Good Crisis for a Critique of Psychology. And an alternative title could have been Against the Psychologization and Digitalization of the COVID Crisis, a Political Plea for a Decent Life. Now, my key argument is that in times of crisis, invariably, there is this moment where the Psy experts and the Psy complex step in, claiming jurisdiction concerning where we should head to. So precisely then, when the Psy experts put forward their simplifying, and I would argue, cardboard-esque depictions of the human being, it's time to be suspicious and oppose their assertions with the words of the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, which are, "What do I know of what I'll be, I who don't know what I am?" So actually, this is the quotation that opens my new book. And it's precisely the latter part of it that is defied by the sciences. You don't know what you are? Well, we do. We have our tests, our quantitative and qualitative research, neuroscience and brain scans, and on top of all that, big data. We know what you are through your Facebook, Instagram, and Google searches. So this is, by the way, what my book is about the psychological and psychologizing slope in the digitalization of subjectivity. So, and of course, in the Corona crisis, the digital and digitalization play a central role. Now, also the philosopher Slavoj Žižek touched upon this when he remarked that the Corona crisis precisely occurred in a time where a lot of voices try to deal with the digitalization of our lives and its possible dystopian outcomes. So Žižek refers to Ray Kurzweil's idea of the singularity. That is the claim that brains in the nearby future could be connected to computers and thus to other brains. And Žižek then asks, and I quote, "From a critical standpoint, which is worse? A greater threat to humanity, the viral devastation of our lives, or the loss of our individuality in singularity?" Epidemics remind us that we remain firmly rooted in bodily existence with all the dangers that this implies. End of quote. I think that as such, Žižek is right in coupling the digital threat to the threat of the virus, but perhaps we should understand this differently than within his claim that the pandemic reminds us of the reality of the bodily. For is it not clear that the pandemic, due to the lockdown, pushes us to the digital, to the virtual, hence to the imaginary? So Žižek, however, I would argue, precisely in his biologistic turn to the reality of the bodily, succumbs to a psychologizing approach, as he has some advice for us, and I quote, "Don't think too much in the long term, just focus on today, what you will be doing till sleep. You might consider playing the game that features in the movie Life is Beautiful, pretend the lockdown is just a game." So Žižek as the next best psychologist. Now compare this with a Belgian psychiatrist advising parents in the lockdown to focus on the everyday routines and make schemes for their children from the moment they awake till they go asleep. The psychiatrist adds then, our brain likes predictability. So the problem with all this psychologizing and neurologizing advice is that it individualizes, desocializes, and depoliticizes. Simply put, it locks you up in your psychology, or better, it locks you up in your brain. And then in his conclusion, the psychiatrist refers to the Dalai Lama and argues that indifference is better than getting wound up with something which you can't control. Now, to illustrate the underlying political and ideological stance of all this, let me refer to how, in a petition, Belgian psychologists and human scientists claimed it was time to complement the medical, biological, and the economic paradigms with the human factor. However, the first critical remark here is, do the mainstream sciences themselves not lean predominantly on both biological and economic neoliberal models? So concerning the first, remember the psychiatrist claim that it is your brain that likes predictability. Or think of how our COVID-induced dreams, which are supposedly more vivid, are explained away with the workings of neurotransmitters. Regarding the second model, the economic model, also this is a main rationale underpinning a lot of the mainstream side discourses. In a newspaper op-ed, a PhD in pedagogy, but above all a mother, pleaded to soften the lockdown rules for pedagogical reasons. Envisioning the psychological well-being of her daughter, she argued that her chances of social learning, essential to learn to be human, were endangered during the lockdown. And then she writes, "My child climbs in trees and makes cakes out of mud, but it needs to do this with other children. It's only by baking mud cakes together that you learn that there is more than one way, that your friend's sand contains too much or too little water, and that the mold of the child who is not your friend produces better cakes than yours," unquote. So what this mother slash PhD in pedagogy, I'm sorry, what she wants is that her child learns to compete. This means that to learn to be human does means to learn to be entrepreneurial. So this is neoliberal ideology smuggled into a pedagogical, psychological approach. So clearly here the side discourses turn out to work in tandem with the entrepreneurial lobby, equally speaking about the urgency to ease the lockdown restrictions in kind of combined call that we cannot let our psychological well-being and our economy be compromised any longer. So hence, to repeat, one should always be wary when the Psy experts show up on the scene, or perhaps better, when Psy experts try to establish the scene with their cardboardesque models of the human being. But of course, it's important to understand that these models were always already in place, structuring the scenes on which the crisis necessarily must play out. So it's only in the bigger crisis that the scenery might be suspended or wiped away. And this is precisely where the Psy experts step in to repaint the crucial lines of the scene, or if needed, to re-establish the scene itself, which is of course a ideological scene. So, and here we can return to the theme of digital technologies for the scenes that were already in place and needed to be re-established are since quite a while the digital scenes. So psychologists, together with officials and health specialists, advised us during lockdown, besides eating well and exercising, we need to use the digital technologies to stay connected. And of course, here it gets particularly tricky to understand the precise role and rationale of the side discourses. For whilst at the one hand, the Psy experts, they promote digital technology as a valuable replacement of social contact, they, on the other hand, find it very important that we all should also know that it's not enough, that the digital is still something different from the real thing. So eventually, for psychologists, there is a claim for a watershed between the technological and the psychological. However, if I'm allowed to go a bit fast here, tracing the history of digital technologies in what becomes then rapidly clear is the involvement of psychologists and psychological theories and models in the development of digital technologies. So, for example, Alan Turing, Norbert Wiener, or Marvin Minsky, all those people, all those authors, which was seminal in the development of digital technologies, all they at a given point referred to Sigmund Freud. So in very short, digital technology is what it is now, thanks to psychologists and psychology. So this is actually what my book is about. But if I'm allowed yet another jump, this leads to our current situation. That is that social media and related digital technologies that house our subjectivities and intersubjectivities are most centrally informed precisely by the mainstream psychological models and theories. So the internet is not as such an initially empty field to be then subsequently filled by psychological and sociological issues. In contrast, I claim, the internet is always already pre-configured in psychological and sociological terms. So hence the caveat of the Psy experts, actually a main mantra in these COVID times, that in the end our psychology / neurobiology is in excess of technology, has to be reversed. For is it not so that technology itself is the very site of the excess, of the too much? So let me give you a first short indication of this too much at the side of the digital with a little anecdote from my own digital Corona times. This is the situation. It's my wife's birthday and we are dining together via Skype with my stepson. And it's nice to be together, we eat and we talk, but it's also intensive, demanding. We watch the screen and also watch, we have to, ourselves. And somehow there is too much of us. There is too much presence. And this we come to realize, and this is where things get out of hand. We start using emoticons, face filters, videos, and so on. And my stepson at a given point starts to gorge with his wine. And I open my mouth really a bit too close in the camera. So this, and well, the night after my wife's birthday party, I read someone commenting on the Corona crisis using a quote of Madame de Sévigné, who in the 17th century wrote, "How tedious those gatherings that deprive us of solitude without affording us company." So hence, regarding the birthday party, I think it was not in the first place that we've missed being bodily and affectively present with each other, but rather it felt as if we were too much present. So digital technologies induce or even impose presence, a full emotive presence. So they rob us from what, they take away from us what normally structures our being together. That is our little absences or even solitude, our non-engaging all the while we are together. So all that has to be traded with a full emotional presence. And the latter, as is the central claim of my book, is steered and pre-configured by algorithms. And the latter are eventually based on the mainstream sociological models of subjectivity and theories of subjectivity. So hence, regarding the lockdown measures, we should not all too rapidly buy into this message of the Psy experts that we are momentarily deprived from the haptic handshakes, hugs, and other forms of real bodily contact for which the digital social media allegedly offers a valuable but not good enough ersatz. So with these arguments of their cardboard-esque psychologists overlook and thus deny us the very intricacies of touch and hugs, being too little, insatiable hunger for touch, for example, or too much, invading our integrity, for example. So all these aspects of discontents or melancholia related to the touch and the theme of bodily contact. So it are these subtleties and niceties that we are robbed from, first by the digital media, locking us up into the narrow confines of memes, hashtags, and emoticons, which are, I claim, precisely based on the simplified mainstream models of psychology. And second, by the hegemonic psychological discourses, reducing that what we allegedly miss to their tedious cliches. Now, to rescue subjectivity and intersubjectivity, or which is the same, to reopen the social and the political questions that are locked down through this double bind of psychologization and digitalization. Let me start from the paradoxical, but maybe obvious observation that in COVID times, we are not really allowed to isolate. Instead, we are driven, I would argue, to fake subjectivities and fake communities. We are not allowed to truly retreat, as arguably this could lead to unchecked and uncontrolled forms of subjectivity and sociality. So consider in this respect the philosopher Catherine Malabou, who experiences the lockdown as an epoche, as a suspension, a bracketing of sociality, which she then claims to be, quote, the only access to authority, a way to feel close to all the isolated people on earth. Such is the reason why I am trying to be as solitary as possible in my loneliness, unquote. So I think Malabou has an important point here. For is sociality, after all, not something which is based on something outside of it, if not a complete non-sociality? So hence, retreat might be the prime condition. So only that what cannot be shared, that what never can become a common, only that can be the object and cause of sociality and communality. So it's precisely digitalization takes away from us. And this becomes particularly clear in the COVID crisis, with the Psi complex being the first guardian to neutralize this dangerous withdrawal, as it could be the starting point for unchecked and uncontrolled subjectivities and intersubjectivities. We are called upon to phone and to Zoom, to use emoticons and likes. We are thus pushed to cardboard-esque, psychosocially pre-configured subjectivities and intersubjectivities. Now, to connect maybe all this to what we are doing here right now, we academics, we are urged to stay in touch with our students, with our colleagues. We are called upon to do conference via Zoom, etc., so that we, instead of doing something else, help preparing the next step in the digitalization of academia and education. So in conclusion, to oppose this being locked down in the highly psychologized virtual media of digital capitalism, one should not take recourse, I would claim, to the biological or the vital, for it's there that via the back door, all kinds of naturalizing and psychologizing conceptions re-enter the scene. So hence when Byung-Chul Han, who the Korean philosopher, who after opposing digitalization to the real of the virus, pleads to save our beautiful planet, I tend to disagree. I would say the planet is not beautiful, nor is the digital sphere. One could wish to make both so, But perhaps we should, above all, strive to make them both more just, to make both a decent place to live. So hence, as such contingent event of the virus can point the way, as at least for some of us, the lockdown has allowed us to focus on the everyday life. And I use the term advisedly. Also, Zizek hints at what he sees as the possible emergence of a new ethics. And I quote, "It's the idea of a world where you have an apartment, basics like food and water, the love of others, and a task that really matters, now more than ever. The idea that one needs more seems unreal now. I cannot imagine a better description of what one should shamelessly call a non-alienated, decent life," unquote. Of course, this idea of the non-alienated, decent life might be a naive and again, potentially psychologizing argument, as Psy experts would again step in and say that they know what a decent life would be. However, I think that one should understand the decent life as a fundamentally political and partisan choice. So politics is the first thing, psychology follows on. To paraphrase the dictum, food is the first thing, morals follow on. So, in conclusion, we need times and space for this decent life. That is also for its discontents and its paradoxes. So we need both real and virtual times and spaces for that. Now, is the digital sphere, that is the digital media and the technologies that we have now, are they fit to do that? My answer is no. For the moment, we can only seek there a minimal temporary sheltering to then withdraw. Thank you very much. So I guess that we open up the discussion.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone, if there are questions from attendees or
It doesn't look like there is any right now.
okay. Maybe we should then take the opportunity to discuss a few things amongst us. I don't know.
Yeah, there is one comment now, but it's just a thank you to you, Jan.
Okay.
Michelle, what do you think? You're unmuted at the moment, but
I'm happy to do whatever you're comfortable with.
do you have any comments for any of the talks or thoughts, anything?
As I said, I'm definitely not a psychology expert, so if anything, you should be telling me everything that I got wrong.
I just, yeah, well, I don't have any real comments. I'm really tired now of looking at the screen, but I just want to thank you both because both of your talks were very interesting. And I think, Jan, your talk actually just emphasized the thoughts that I have about the moral obligation in psychology as well. So thank you for that. It was very inspiring. I think maybe, maybe there was a question. Jordana says, if there is a time, I would add that Zizek also said at the beginning that this crisis is the unique opportunity to abandon capitalism and reclaim communism. What would you say on that? And I think it's for you, Jan.
Yeah.
You can use the Q&A tool to read the question again.
Yeah.
If you,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. But maybe it's a question for all of us three to consider if the COVID crisis opens up perspectives of, for something alternative and something different. And Zizek, yeah, he said it's that the COVID crisis would open the possibility of instead of a disaster capitalism, as he calls it, I think after Naomi Klein, to be replaced by something like a disaster communism, which is also, I think, Jean-Luc Nancy, who made a similar remark. But of course, when you look at what Naomi Klein describes, how already in New York, a lot of digital pundits are stepping in and using the crisis as a lever to well, impose or hasten or enforce a digital based capitalism, then well, we should be very wary of the chances that this moment could offer us. So and I had tried to stress also that then the role of psychologists is very important, and we should be very critical of the role they play, and above all what the underlying discourses are. For especially then if you look at academia in this crisis will be used to further digitalize education, for example. Also, there is a lot of things going on digitalizing mental health care. And I think that the risk is that there will be deepening and widening of antagonisms, such as for the poor people, we will have AI education, and then the wealthy will afford to have real bodily teachers. Such also there's already a like in the digital mental health services that the free services you can use a AI bot, a therapeutic bot, a robot, and which comes in the form of a penguin, so it's very infantilizing and so on. And if you pay, then you get a real therapist attending to your needs. So I think that there's a lot of well, very scaring or worrying tendencies that we see arising in this crisis. But I know if you two yourselves are thinking about what are the chances for some more emancipatory movements or spaces.
Well, perhaps I'd like to think so, but I mean, we always kind of see these moments of crisis as moments of potential political change, because it disrupts, to go back to what we're saying, what we know. And when you disrupt what you think you know, then there are opportunities to bring in new ways of doing things. And this has always been seen as, a potential moment for revolution. But I think that particularly at the moment, what I see are actually people looking to the government for support. and reassurance. They're looking for a return to what we think of as normal ways of thinking, which are fundamentally capitalist ways of thinking. And I see a lot of the arguments going on about COVID, particularly around ending the lockdown, as about getting back to capitalist ways of doing things. That the economy has been held up over issues around health. And yes, that idea has been challenged. There are a lot of people who object to the way in which the economy has been put over people's health. But you also can't ignore that, you know, when Boris Johnson wants to get the country back on side, the first thing he does is says that he's going to reopen shops. He's going to get the economy back moving. He's going to get people back to work. And that is a message that a lot of people want to hear. So in some ways, people, I think, are being, you know, are actually looking to capitalist ways, modes of doing things, because that represents normality and it represents security at a time when there isn't a lot of security. And that there are people who are going to deliberately capitalize on that, who want more, you know, capitalist ways of thinking. And this is a way of doing things. And, you know, what we see are, you know, new controls coming in that are going to facilitate that. Even things like health apps that are going to monitor where people are, new legislation that brings in emergency powers that, you know, is going to last for the next 2 years, so way beyond what we think this lockdown might look like. Those are procedures that are going to make any attempt at social revolution or any type of shift away from the way that we were doing things before COVID. It's going to make that incredibly difficult. So I'm afraid I don't have much hope for the communist revolution just yet.
We have 2 more questions coming in, so I think we should move to them. Paul asks, he says, many important goals that you have expressed. Do you have suggestions about steps to take for communicating these insights to the larger community that is currently not paying any attention to these concerns? And I don't know if it's to one of us or just all of us.
I don't know if anyone wants to give it a go.
Well, maybe this ties into what I was actually just saying, that I think communication is going to be very difficult at the moment. We are in such a state of flux and insecurity that getting messages out is incredibly difficult. And I think that a lot of messages are kind of taking on a life of their own in this. Just look at the Dominic Cummings story. Like that has just been picked up and turned into a story in a way that, you know, PR guys at number 10 would not be very happy about. So I think we're talking about some really big risks. I think you're absolutely right, but I think until COVID-19 stops being the only thing that we can think of, there's not going to be much room to be thinking about those other risks. And I think that's very problematic, because things are going to get ignored that really need to be looked at. That I think, you know, I talked about using this crisis as an opportunity. You know, I talked about it in terms of social revolution, but from my perspective, in terms of looking at things like biological arms control, this could be an opportunity that we could be seizing on to do fantastic things to help prevent the use of biological weapons. But if we don't take that opportunity, it may never happen. Like I say, particularly if people move on and forget and they move away from COVID-19, that opportunity to make people see the threat that they face with biological weapons is going to get lost. But how do you communicate that? I mean, as I said, you know, disease makes something like biological weapons a lot more known. People are taking that more seriously, but unless that threat is there right in people's faces, then people may not take it seriously in the future. Like I say, that opportunity will be lost. But I also don't think that now is the best time for people to be receptive about the idea that, you know, terrorists are about to, you know, start sending more anthrax letters or stuff like that, when they're worried that they can't even leave their homes right now. So it's definitely this is an opportunity to make people aware of these threats, but I don't have a lot of confidence that any type of communication is going to really happen when people are so psychologically overwhelmed with what is happening with COVID-19 right now. I don't know what the other two panelists would think.
Would you want to move on to the next question, Jan? It's for you.
Okay. Maybe I also try, in the meantime, to answer the previous question. How do you communicate insights and so on? Well, part of me says it's not about communicating insights and knowledges, which maybe then connects to what Michelle was saying about the knowns and the unknowns, because what the experts today do is they claim the knowns, and they claim from there to set out the path to go, which is then allegedly scientifically warranted. So it's therefore that I evoked the words of Pessoa, who actually speaks of this not knowing. It's like he says that he doesn't know what he will be, as he doesn't know what he is now. So and then I always come back on the same quotation, which is one of Robert Fuller, who is a philosopher on art. And he says that theory doesn't have to say what art has to think, but theory only has to offer art what not to think. So this is the insights that you communicate. Well, it doesn't give a clear perspective on what you should do, because this is, I think, the ideological and the political perspective. So if anything, in the other question also refers or probes this, if anything, or if I read it, the second thing is related to decent life that I promoted. Is there any issue that you think that we need to focus on related to that idea, and so on? I think the first thing, maybe I could refer to a biblical passage where Jesus removes the how do you say, the merchants and the money traders from the temple. I think the first thing we should do to ensure this perspective of a decent life is to get out the psychologists. So in the same way as Jesus removed the merchants from the temple. So.
I have a comment regarding how do we communicate these insights. I think that's a wall that we keep bumping into, and it's kind of, sometimes I find it very unheartening or disheartening. But I think one way is that we could do is that we, as the experts or the psychological researchers, we should try to create knowledge in the sense of the common good. And a way to do this is, or could be, engaging in working with people and trying to create research that demonstrate that things do work. And here I think in particular on practice research, and to engage with people as co-researchers, and to try to start with the problem as perceived by the people experiencing them. So that was just my thoughts. Did you answer the last one, Jan? To how to understand psychologization boom? What are its origins?
That's a very big question. Of course, the origins is, as I think, also Athanasios Marvakis in his keynote at this conference pointed at psychologization. Its origin is psychology as such. I would agree with what he said, is that psychologization is inextricably bound to the advent of psychology itself, in a way that just two sides of the same issue. And to understand the psychologization boom now in current COVID times, I think that in my talk I try to address this is that it has its function in the whole ideological scheme of the digitalization and digital capitalism. So it's obvious that psychologization had to pop up in this crisis sooner or later. So this is what I try to make sense of, and I think it's very important to make sense of this, how this returns in full force in this crisis. Yeah.
So, is there any new ones? No. There's one more from Paul. The last response, starting with experts listening to problems as perceived by non-expert people, seems a good starting point. One which can address the other responses as well, with less listening to expert psychologists and more addressing of the limited hopes that are circulating now. So thank you for that comment, or thank you for all comments, that is. So what do you think? Should we wait the last minutes, or should we say thank you? What?
We could say thank you. That's always the
yeah, I think that sounds like fun.
Yeah, good. Well, then thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you both for some really fascinating papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and take care.
Yeah, until the next time, maybe in Paris.
Next time, yes, let's hope so.
Yeah, okay.
And thank you for all the comments and questions as well from the attendees.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.